Welcome back, everybody. We are back in the book of Job, and we are going to be in chapters 38 through 41 today. So, if you remember from the book of Job, Job had lost everything: his family, his health, his livelihood. And Job spends the majority of this book sort of wrestling with the one central question: why is this happening to me? I haven't done anything wrong. Why is this happening? All his friends, they say, you must have done something wrong if all this is happening. All this suffering can only mean one thing, that you're hiding some sort of sin and God is angry at you for it. But what if I told you that when God finally answered Job, he didn't actually answer the question that Job had been asking the entire time? When God finally speaks, you would expect him to explain the suffering that Job's been going through, to maybe pull back the curtain and reveal the reason behind it all. But that's not what happens. Instead, what God does is respond in a way that completely reforms the situation, and if we really understand it, it has the power to change how we view our own struggles. So, with all of that said, let's dive in to 38 through 41. All right, so chapters 38 through 41 are powerful. They are somewhat unexpected, some unexpected moments in the book of Job. And it's the point where God finally breaks his silence after everything that Job has gone through and Job has endured. If you've ever found yourself questioning God or feeling confused about what he's doing in your life, or maybe you're simply wondering why certain things are happening to you the way that they are, then this passage is incredibly relevant to you, because what God says to Job is not just for Job, it's also for us. So to kick off chapter 38, verse 1 says, Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. He doesn't come in quietly or gently. He speaks out of a storm, and that alone is significant because it reminds us that God often shows up in the middle of our chaos, not just after it's passed. The first words he speaks are striking. Verse 2, Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Now, it's important to call out that this is not God dismissing Job's pain. Job's suffering certainly is very real, and God never denies that. What God is confronting, however, is Job's assumption that he fully understands the big picture. He fully understands what's going on. In other words, Job spent a long time asking questions to God, and now God is going to ask some questions to him. So God immediately begins with a question that puts things into perspective. Verse 4, Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you know so much. From there, he walks Job through creation in a way that is both poetic and overwhelming. He speaks about setting boundaries to the seas. We see that in verse 8 through 11. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb? And as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness, for I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, This far and no further will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. In verse 12, he continues by how he's commanded the morning. He says, Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Then jumping down to verse 16, he asks, Have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? And what God is doing here is not random. He's intentionally moving through different aspects of creation: the earth, the oceans, the sunrise, the depths of the sea. He's showing Job the vastness and complexity of what he alone sustains. And he even points to the stars in verse 31, where he says, Can you direct the movement of the stars, binding the cluster of the Pleiades, or loosening the cords of Orion? Can you direct the constellations through the seasons, or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens? And so the message from God becomes clear. He's not explaining Job's suffering, he's expanding Job's perspective. Because once you begin to grasp just how big God is, it changes how you view what you are going through. So God is asking Job all of these questions that Job can't possibly answer, and that's exactly the point. There are realities in the world that exist completely outside of human awareness. In other words, there are limits to what we can see, what we can know, and what we can understand. And that leads us to a powerful truth. Just because you cannot see what God is doing does not mean that He's not working. There are depths to His activity, just like the depths of the ocean, that remain hidden from us, but are fully known to Him. But then God shifts from the vastness of the universe to the details of everyday life in creation. In verse 39, he says, Can you stalk prey for a lioness and satisfy the young lion's appetites as they lie in their dens or crouch in the thicket? Who provides food for the ravens when their young cry out to God and wander about in hunger? Continuing into chapter 39, verse 1 says, Do you know when the wild goats give birth? Verse 5, Who gives the wild donkey its freedom? Who untied its rope? Verse 19, Have you given the horse its strength, or clothed its neck with a flowing mane? And verse 27, Is it at your command that the eagle rises to the heights that it are to make its nests? So, what God is doing here is showing that his care and his involvement extend into places and moments where human beings never even witness or never even see. He's sustaining life constantly, even when nobody's watching. And what's interesting is in the New Testament, Jesus echoes the same truth later in the book of Matthew, where he says, "Look at the birds of the air, your heavenly Father feeds them." And the implication is simple but profound. God is attentive to them. He has certainly not overlooked you, he's not overlooked me. So, after hearing all of this, Job responds in a way that marks a turning point for him. In verse 4 of chapter 40, he says, "I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand." So, notice there what has changed. Job has still not received an explanation for his suffering, but he encountered God in a deeper way. And that encounter leads to humility for Job. Then God says something to Job that kind of goes straight to the heart. In verse 8, he says, "Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove you're right?" It's a question that sort of forces reflection. Because if we're honest, there are moments where we're tempted to assume that if we don't understand what God is doing, then somehow God must be wrong. But I think the reminder for all of us is that our understanding is limited, while God's is not. And then finally, God brings up two very powerful creatures. In verse 15, he says, "Take a look at Behemoth." At the bottom of my Bible, there's a footnote that says the identification of Behemoth is disputed, ranging from an earthly creature to a mythical sea monster in ancient literature. So there you go. But in verse 15, he says, "Take a look at Behemoth, which I made, just as I made you. It eats grass like an ox." It's basically just something that represents immense strength, something that is beyond human control. Then, verse 1 of chapter 41, he says, "Can you catch the Leviathan with a hook or put a noose around its jaw?" And again, there's a footnote at the bottom of my Bible for the Leviathan. It says the identification of the Leviathan is disputed, ranging from an earthly creature to a mythical sea monster in ancient literature. But regardless, it represents something chaotic, something dangerous, something unpredictable, something untamable, from at least from a human perspective. And yet God speaks to both of these things as creations that are fully under his authority. And the message that God is giving to Job is unmistakable. The things that feel overwhelming, the things that feel uncontrollable in our lives, are not outside of God's control. What looks like chaos to me and you is still subject to him. So, what does all this mean to me and you? What does all this mean to us? I believe that ultimately what we need most is not a detailed explanation of everything that's happening in our lives, but a deeper trust in God who sees all the things that we cannot. In the book of Isaiah, it says, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways." Faith is not about having all of our questions answered, it's about trusting the one who already understands the full picture. The book of Romans says, and we know that in all things God works for the good. For the good. Your pain is real, but it does not define the end of your story. So let me leave you with this. If you've ever asked yourself the question, why? Why is this happening to me? Why didn't things go differently? Why am I still waiting for an answer? Just know that you're not alone. Perhaps today, instead of receiving an answer, you're being invited into something deeper with God. Trust. And you're invited to be still and know that He is God. And if you've never taken that step of truly placing your life in God's hands, know that the same God who governs the universe and commands the storm is inviting you into a relationship with Him. Won't He do it?